Assessment is a primary part of all good instruction. It's how you find out whether the skills and the abilities and the understandings that you wanted were achieved in your course or your communication. And to do that, let's start by thinking about the many ways you've been assessed within MALET courses and in this MALET program. You've had a number of reports. You've had discussions where you've interacted with colleagues, and they often are assessed as a participation grade. You've had times where you've had pictures that you might have taken in a virtual environment and looped back into a discussion board. You've also created video challenges where you showed to others what you were learning, and you've had opportunities to meet synchronously with people, for instance, in a virtual reality environment. Now, you can also have an assessment that actually is what you call an authentic assessment, something where the instructor can look at what you've done, but the project itself illustrates the learning activities that you needed to acquire. For instance, whether you're using Prezi or PowerPoint, as you talked about a possible game that might make sense in your environment, or whether you could do a Google site as a way to house your portfolio. Those were what you call authentic assessments. Now, these assessment strategies don't just happen. They come from a well-designed course. You begin by thinking about what you want the student to achieve by the end, and then you back into that, put in the particular assignments that are needed, and you should be basing those on education principles. For example, if we go to Piaget, our key pundit, he really believed that building schema was very important. Those mental schema acquired with some reasonable struggle were important. Now, Vygotsky added to that the concept that sometimes having a more knowledgeable other around, for example, when you were learning how to dress your avatar, was something that was supported by the community of practicing teacher educators that were working together. So you also had an environment that was really scaffolded. Things weren't just randomly put in there. You learned a lot of technologies in a systematic way, and you had the support from tutorials such as lynda.com to help you there. Now, all of these particular assignments on which you need to be assessed were aligned with the course objectives. And so there were objectives involving the technology, and there were also objectives involving design. And another important objective was learning how to work with colleagues. That's an unknown entity before you go into a course, but it can be a very productive way to learn. Now, learning was evaluated in two different ways within courses. In an ongoing way, as you're actually learning, and that's called a formative assessment. That gives you a chance to increase and improve your skill. Now, you'll notice that there was a lot of written constructive feedback given, and in that, areas that might need to be developed were pointed out, but also areas where you were really hitting the mark was pointed out as well, because that's the kind of constructive feedback that helps you grow. At the end of the course, you will be getting summative assessments on papers. You might be getting badges. Your projects will be evaluated. So that comes at the end. Now, assessment is designed to allow for the individuals to change. And sometimes when you get specific feedback, you might need to make some adjustments. Sometimes, though, the instructor or the designer finds that the course itself is what needs improvement. And we'll talk more about that at the end. So all of this is designed to help you grow towards the objectives of the course. Now, there are situations where a student gets particular feedback, and this is particularly in K-12. They're finding that by the research, if you don't actually assimilate that feedback and move forward, it really just becomes a document that's not particularly meaningful. So you have to be sure that if you're giving feedback, there's a way that you can, as the instructor, ensure that that feedback's assimilated. Because the idea of a feedback loop is not to be punitive, it's not a gotcha, it's to help you learn better going forward. Now, To learn, though, the instructor needs to be very clear about what's expected, particularly with complex assignments. So you need to have clear expectations that are aligned with the course objectives, with the assignment objectives, and sometimes that can be also given as a grading sheet. Here's a spreadsheet that I've used in the past to give feedback on specific criteria. You can also design rubrics. Rubrics sort of generalize the criteria that's being looked at and give 1 through 5 scales, depending on how you choose to display them, on the different criteria and what you need to do to succeed in each criteria. They can help guide the project itself. So they're not simply a document that's brought in at the end. But you have to be sure when you design a rubric that you're assessing all of the criteria, not simply a project presentation. You want to be sure that the content is richly articulated in the rubric as well. And a downside to a rubric can be, particularly with K-12, that students can game the system. They may not want to get an A or might not want to put the effort in to get an A. So they may look at lower levels and just decide that that's fine for them. So you always have to be careful with a rubric. Now, what you've done and what you've learned, reflect back on all your assessment points. And let's now look at some things you weren't assessed, some methods that you weren't assessed by, the classic methods. And some of those methods come after the course is done, and they're there to make sure you didn't forget. Now, the problem with these methods, as we'll be looking at, is they can assess your learning right after the course, but is your learning something that's going to stay with you for a long time? So these classic assessments that occur after the learning can be the traditional multiple choice questions that you see. They can be fill-in-the-blank questions. They can be short answers that are in an essay format. All of these are important ways to assess learning, and they're particularly important if you're doing large-scale assessments, as you might do in a school or in the military or even in an institution. So the strength of these type of assessments is they can really be easily graded, and today there's a lot of automatic scoring. Now, we're going to see they're not always easy to develop good questions here, but today with electronics, test banks are becoming available, and so if you're dealing with content that has test banks, you might get some help there. You can also design these tests to be game-like, and there's the whole concept of gamification, which will allow these short questions to be enjoyed by the student, hopefully, and therefore they're going to be willing to stay with the assessment a little bit longer. And wonderfully too is that these assessments can be scaled. Very important for, say, military, K-12. They can be run with a lot of different people without needing to have a faculty member who's looking at each person's work individually. Now, there are programs coming out, such as Quizlets and Kahoots, that can help teachers design quizzes, and a very nice thing about them is they're developing test banks, for example, these biology test banks. And you can also benefit from the ease of putting tests right into online formats or making them available through a website. Now, the weakness is it's hard to make good test questions. It's very easy to start putting all of your test questions down at the lower level of memorizing. You will find that sometimes these can be just either too easy for kids or prone too much to memorization. Now, they also are not good at addressing the complexity of learning. They're not very good for projects. And remember, too, that the testing is an extra. It's not part of the learning process. So there's always that limitation with this type of classic testing. Now, moving into the field of online work, there are new ways to test, and the field of analytics is coming out. Analytics can be, for instance, a report that you get about attendance in an online course. Analytics can be about the statistics that are generated at a website. Analytics can tell you how often an avatar visited your virtual space. And analytics can collect likes and dislikes that people might have had about a topic that you've gathered. And then from there, you can generate a lot of data to help you understand the use of that particular space. Now, I also want to conclude with a mention of evaluation. The way I define it, and you should always check the definitions from any particular author, is the environment that is surrounding the learner. And if you're in a face-to-face class, that's self-evident. Is there a whiteboard? Are the seats in the right place? Are there computers if they're needed? In online environments, it's a little trickier. Are people able to access your website or get into your virtual space? A field is emerging because of so much more online work where you're actually looking at this user interface and you're looking at the user interaction. So that's another important evaluative area that you want to keep abreast of if you're designing online courses. And all of these assessments are paramount to your having a successful course, for your putting the improvements into the course, as well as guiding the particular learners. And it's so important that we have an entire course devoted to these. So right now, this is simply a segue into the course where you'll really have an opportunity to delve into those really critical assessment practices. So thank you for your attention.